as we know, with the pandemic, with COVID, it is an ever changing, ever evolving world, especially in labor and employment. So I applaud everyone for attending, for continuing to learn, because that's what we have to do right now. And I think one thing that you all are doing well is having these learning collaboratives, because I think collaborative is probably the most important word. We always can learn from each other. We can always learn you know what other organizations are doing, whether right or wrong, and we're happy to discuss those as well today. But this is really about answering your questions and making sure that the policies and the practices that you all implement over the next several months are in compliance, and I'm able to answer whatever questions you have. So like Jessica said, feel free to put questions in the chat. At the end, I really want to encourage everyone to have an open conversation about what you're doing in the organization. Is it working? Is it not working? So we'll kind of jump in, and Jessica's going to be my, I guess, assistant to make sure that we get through these slides. So we can go to the next slide. So I really feel like, especially over the last week, where things changed rather quickly, I think that we are kind of at the light at the end of a tunnel, I hope. Last week, the CDC made changes, Maryland made changes. Even this week, we see, local jurisdictions making changes. If you were in a restaurant business, you would have changes every single week. But I think any business is constantly seeing updates to compliance and regulations. So I think we're getting there. And as employees start becoming vaccinated and as vaccinations become more available, you're definitely going to see a lot of changes and things opening up. So we should all celebrate that. And with that, I want to show you how far we've come in the next slide. And we really should pause and appreciate where we were last year at this time, and how far we've come this year. We now have 3 emergency authorized use vaccines. Everyone 12 years of age or older can be vaccinated, and they should have accessibility to become vaccinated if they so choose. In the United States, 48% of Americans have received 1 dose of the vaccine, and 37% have become fully vaccinated. But if you look at the older population, they were the first ones, remember, to receive the vaccine, 85% have received 1 dose and 73% have been fully vaccinated. I know now that we don't really talk about herd immunity, but way back when, herd immunity was at like 75%. So I think having those numbers, especially for the older population, I mean, that's a huge goal that I think the United States was able to accomplish. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how far Maryland has come. 66% have received 1 dose of the vaccine, and 42% have become fully vaccinated. Maryland's doing great. I think we may have started out slow, but we've definitely, we've definitely ramped up our efforts, and vaccinations again are available to all Marylanders 12 and older. You can see we're in phase 3. I remember when we were in phase like 1A or 1B, I thought we'd never move out of 1A or 1B. We kind of just stayed there. And I was like, oh, we're never going to get to phase 3. But here we are. We're at phase 3. So that's great that everybody has that opportunity. I know they're still working with the younger population, and hopefully that's something that we see, I think, by the end of the summer, hopefully. So next slide. So really today we are going to kind of answer questions about vaccines. And with vaccines come a lot of other questions that we'll touch on, and that kind of plays into, the mask, the no mask, those questions as well. because they're all kind of interrelated. So next slide. So last week, the CDC, I think it was as of Thursday, issued their mask guidance. And this is a very helpful color-coded chart that came directly from the CDC website that kind of highlights what fully vaccinated people are allowed to do and what unvaccinated people, I guess, should not do. Whether you participate and not, and whether you have to wear a mask and whether you don't have to wear a mask. So, I kind of look at it as, you have all the fully vaccinated people in, one room having, pizza and laughing and having fun. And then you have on the other side, the unvaccinated people, they have their mask on and they can't do anything fun. So it was kind of sad in that regard. But I think aside from that, and I certainly don't want to imply that, wearing mask is sad. It's just that you have to protect, you have different protections. And so masks are that added protection, or at least that's what, science says. And wearing a mask, make sure it doesn't spread the virus to anyone else. So that's why the mask mandate is out there. Next slide. So the fully vaccinated persons can resume activities without wearing masks or physically distancing, except, and I highlight this because this is very important, except where required by federal, state, local, tribal, territorial laws, including businesses and workplace guidance. So while the CDC and even Maryland has said that, fully vaccinated people do not need to wear masks, it still is left up to the local jurisdictions, it's left up to local businesses, and certainly left up to workplace guidance. So if you and your business or workplace want to continue wearing masks, you absolutely can do that. That is up to you. I think, Walmart and Costco have decided that they are going to not have a mask mandate policy, whereas Target is going to continue with their mask mandate policy. So it just depends. The other thing that you're allowed to do is resume domestic travel, refrain from testing before or after travel. I put these in there because these are important for organizations that, resume business travel as well. You want, in those businesses that require testing, I wanted that to be in there. Refrain from testing before leaving the US for international travel, and refrain from self-quarantine after arriving back in the United States. Refrain from testing following a known exposure. We actually had that in our office as recently as last week. A fully vaccinated person came in contact with someone who tested positive for COVID. And if you are asymptomatic, then you do not necessarily need to quarantine from that known exposure, which I thought was interesting. So, and you can refrain from routine screening testing if feasible. Now remember, months ago, we have all these testing policies, we have all these requirements, and we have all these, stay away for 10 days, make sure you get tested, let us know. So we have, if you're fully vaccinated, the guidelines have changed and the requirements have changed. So if you are looking to redo your policies, you can base it off of CDC guidance, state or local rules or regulations. That's what you want to base it off of. Anything outside of that, we can talk about, you can certainly be more extreme, but if you're going to relax the guidance any more than what has been, I guess, required or stated, that's where we're going to we're going to create some issues for that organization and possibly expose that organization to liabilities. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as everything is opening up and as we are seeing more and more people vaccinated, we're going to kind of talk about returning employees to the workplace. I know in the healthcare space, most everybody is back in the workplace. A number of my clients still have yet to return to the workplace, and they're considering that in September. But the question on everybody's mind is whether we can make vaccines mandatory. Should they be non-mandatory? What does that returning to work look like? What are the exemptions? How can I accommodate employees who are not vaccinated? And can I terminate employees for refusals to become vaccinated? I think these are some of the top questions that I see from my clients. Again, I want to make sure that I answer your questions. So if we don't cover all of the questions during this collaborative, I want you all to feel free to ask those at the end or even in the chat as we go along. Okay, next slide. So to vaccine or not to vaccine, I put a chart out there to kind of highlight what companies are considering when they're trying to decide about mandatory vaccines or recommend vaccines. Mandatory vaccines, it keeps the workforce healthy, reduces absences due to illness, reduce time missed from work to get vaccinated, improve productivity, improve morale. There are exemptions and you do need a plan. If anybody has a flu vaccine plan in place already, then you are going to want to follow a similar type plan in mandating the COVID vaccines. If you're going to recommend vaccines, that allows individuals to make their own decisions. You do need to train managers on how you communicate that vaccines are recommended, and we'll talk about what you can ask, what you can't ask. We may not want our managers, and this happens all the time, everybody gets their second shot and you ask the question, oh, how did you feel? Did you have any reactions? In the legal world, asking those detailed questions about how people react, if they're sick after that, possibly that opens you up to a conversation that you may not want to have with that employee. It does, vaccinations improve employee relations and morale, having more and more people vaccinated. It avoids those medical conversations, especially if you have that mandatory vaccine, and you can provide incentives for your employees to get vaccinated as opposed to mandating those vaccines. Okay, next slide. Can employers mandate vaccines? Yes, yes, and yes, they can. So the justification for mandating COVID-19 vaccines is unvaccinated employees, going back to last summer or going back last year, present a direct threat to others in the workplace. They've also determined that a vaccine is not a medical examination, so therefore you can go ahead and mandate those vaccines. But since it poses a direct threat to others, that's why we can mandate that in the workplace. And that goes for any type of health related pandemic. So if you're creating some type of policy and you are looking to mandate COVID-19 vaccines, you may want to consider, because COVID-19 may not be the last time we have a catastrophic health pandemic, you may want to create a policy that takes into account other types of pandemics that may occur in the future. So, this is something that you want to think about. If you don't want to mandate vaccines, or you think, oh, well, I'm only going to mandate COVID-19 vaccines and I'm not going to mandate other vaccines. Just think about that if you're going to create a long-term policy. Okay, next slide. So when we look at whether vaccines were medical examinations, administration of a vaccination is not a medical examination. However, the pre-screening vaccination questions are the ones that elicit that information about a disability. And you'll see that, well, I should take that back. So under the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, we as employers need to accommodate an employee who has a qualified disability and provide a reasonable accommodation so long as it doesn't provide an undue hardship to the employer or to the organization. So when you know about a qualified disability, then you now have an obligation, if it affects their job or a condition of their job, to have have a discussion with them about whether they need an accommodation or not. So if you're just administering a vaccination, if you create a mandatory vaccine policy and you say everybody in my organization needs to be vaccinated because it creates a direct threat to the health and safety of my employees and a direct health and safety, excuse me, direct threat to the health and safety of clients or even patients that you're dealing with, then the next question is, you have an employee who says, well, I don't want to be vaccinated or I can't be vaccinated based upon a pre-existing condition or disability, whether it's an allergy, whether it's a pregnancy or something else that their doctor, recommends that they don't get the vaccine. So that has now opened you up to have that discussion. You've become aware of a disability and you need to decide whether they're exempt from that vaccine and what that accommodation looks like if you're requiring everybody to be back in the office or back at work. Now, if a third party administers the vaccine, meaning an outside third party that the company has hired to administer these vaccines, then you will have no knowledge as an employer of those pre-screening questions. So if I hire, MedStar to come in and make sure that everybody's vaccinated, MedStar can ask all those questions, or LabCorp, whoever is going to do the vaccinations can ask those questions. As long as they don't tell the employer the answers to those pre-screening questions, then you're protected and you will not have access to those disability type information. If the vaccine is voluntary, again, there's no chance that you as an employer will even learn of a disability because it's voluntary. The employee goes, we all sign those pre-screening, questions about allergies or any pre-existing conditions, and your employer will never know about those pre-screening questions. So it's okay. Okay, next slide. So as we're talking, obviously medical, there's really two exemptions to mandatory vaccines. Medical, which is under the ADA, which kind of, like I said, allergy, pregnancy, qualifying medical condition, that's provided under the ADA. And then the second one is the religious exemption. Some people may decline vaccination because of a sincerely held religious belief. And that one is a little more challenging to, I guess, pinpoint than the medical one. If you go to the next slide, you will see that religious discrimination is under, actually I don't have it there, but it's under Title VII. And employees may be exempt due to sincerely held religious belief, but the definition of religion is broad and it protects beliefs, practices, and observances with which the employer may be unfamiliar. We do not know, well, we really shouldn't know, but we don't know any religions that all of our employees are practicing. So what the Department of Labor or the EEOC has said is that we should assume that an employee's request for that accommodation is legitimate and based off of their sincerely held religious belief. Now, if you really have objective evidence that one of your employees does not practice that religion or does not have a sincerely held religious belief, you can certainly ask follow-up questions, but I caution you because delving into religion is difficult if you as the employer are not aware of all the tenets or practices of that specific religion. I don't know there's so many religions out there. But if one of your employees, says that they're a member of a certain religious group and you've never heard of it or they've never talked about it, and you think that, this is something they got off the internet, you could certainly have a follow-up question, discussion with them. But keep in mind that, that is something that an employee you would have to provide an accommodation for if that's the case. So next slide. Any questions so far, Jessica? Probably not. Okay. Just jump in if there are any questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't see it while I...
So far, there aren't any questions.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Faith. Give me 1 second. Let me go back.
Okay, so the next exemption is really, like I said, under the ADA, if they have a qualified disability, pregnancy, or, oh, whoops.
Can you see, or is it?
Yeah, I didn't know if you just jumped ahead. No, go back. Okay. It should be page 14, perfect.
Got it.
Got it, okay. So what can an employer do if an employee says, I need an accommodation, or I'm not going to get vaccinated because I have a disability? So if an employee who cannot be vaccinated, you have to really look at whether, well, this is, what the EEOC says is, look to determine if they pose that direct threat to the workplace. In determining direct threat, they've outlined these 4 factors: duration of the risk, nature and severity of the potential harm, likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. And like I said, last year when everybody was unvaccinated, the direct threat was significant, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that unvaccinated employees posed a direct threat. Now, when we have, a workforce where a number of employees are vaccinated, you have to evaluate what that direct threat looks like. So by bringing an unvaccinated employee back into the workforce, and like I said, 70–80% of the workforce is vaccinated, do they pose a direct threat? Maybe not as much as they did last year. Now, with that said, if you were an organization that everybody returned last year because you're an essential employee, you're dealing in healthcare, and everybody had to continue working, maybe there wasn't as much of a direct threat because you implemented certain safety precautions, you have PPEs, you have mask, you social distance, you followed all of the guidelines that were recommended at the time, so that reduced the direct threat in the workplace. So it's not that if someone refuses to get vaccinated, we say, oh, well, we're just going to fire you. You really have to have that discussion as to whether they have a disability, whether they have a sincerely held religious belief, really what type of direct threat they pose. And if they don't, they can come back to work and follow certain safety guidelines that you have in place. Again, this is why it's important to have those safety guidelines, because, and especially the ones recommended by the CDC or by, the county or the state or even OSHA, is if you follow the guidelines, that limits your exposure to any type of liability. And it makes it difficult for an employee to say, well, they forced me to return to work and I got COVID and I can't believe that. But again, the guidelines are in place, vaccinations are available, and you would reduce your exposure to any of that liability because you weren't negligent. I guess you weren't a negligent workplace in offering these safety precautions. And I think that's really what you have to look at as an organization when you are having these discussions with these employees. Now, if you don't have the safety precautions in place and you're returning an unvaccinated employee to a workplace that has no PPEs or doesn't even offer them, or, everyone is maskless and everyone's unvaccinated, that's going to be a different conversation than, because then they do pose a direct threat to the workplace. Okay, next slide. So if there's, like I said, if there's no direct threat that can be documented, you should grant the exemption. As more employees are vaccinated, that's what we were saying before, the direct threat posed by a few unvaccinated employees disappears. If there is a direct threat, let's talk about in the, whether you can provide a reasonable accommodation. And the reasonable accommodation for someone that poses a direct threat. So let's say someone poses a direct threat and we need to either keep them away from the office or make sure that they have the proper PPEs. So if you're able to provide PPEs or encourage mask wearing, or maybe they have a flexible work schedule, they don't come in direct contact with anybody, those are all reasonable accommodations. Working remotely, dependent upon the job, obviously, you can use that as a reasonable accommodation. If you have someone who is maybe behind the scenes and they're not engaging directly with clients or patients, then they could work from home. Maybe they're working in accounting or they're doing something like that. That's a reasonable accommodation to have that individual stay and work from home. If they are engaging and you need them to return to the workplace and they provide, I guess, or you determine that there's a direct threat, you're going to have to come up with some type of reasonable accommodation that doesn't pose an undue hardship on your business. Now, undue hardship is very difficult to meet that standard. So I want to caution everybody before you say, oh, it's going to create an undue hardship, because what courts look at in defining an undue hardship is a lot different than what businesses look at in an undue hardship. So it's based off of a monetary amount. I mean, if the organization can afford to accommodate that employee in a different way, they need to. Now, if that employee, if their job requirement needs them to be at the place of work, they have to engage with others, they have to be on call, anything like that, you want to make sure that they are able to do that. And if that person were to leave, would that create an undue hardship at the workplace? So we really have to evaluate that. Okay, any questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
What is this meeting about?
This is about COVID-19 vaccines.
Oh, well then I have a good idea. The government should first take the numbers from the survey of the amount of people they made last fall. Then they double that number to create that number of vaccines. And after they do that, what they do is they send it to one person. They send all the vaccines to one place in each city, which is easy for everybody to get to. They put high security on it. Then.
No, that's good. That was very good. Those are some good suggestions, and I think we all can appreciate that. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and we can certainly discuss different types of accommodations that maybe your organization is looking at. But I think before we jump into terminating employees, we really have to have that interactive discussion or dialogue. Okay, next slide. So like I said, can I deny accommodation based upon an undue hardship? You can, if it really would pose an undue hardship. And, like I said, that's a very high standard to meet as an organization. So that would be something that if you're really considering denying an accommodation or terminating an employee, I would recommend that you probably speak to counsel. If you are basing it off of an undue hardship, there's certainly other reasons that we can maybe have a different outcome with that employee. Remember, for every accommodation that is requested, employers do have the option of offering their own accommodation. You do not have to accept the accommodation that the employee suggests. You can always have a conversation about a different type of accommodation, and there's always options out there. The other thing you want to make sure is that they really have a qualified disability. And as you know, with qualified disabilities, you can ask for follow-up medical certification. You can ask for a doctor's note to make sure that you are accommodating the disability that the employee has stated. Okay, next slide. Okay, back to our pre-screening vaccine questions. If they do ask, well, let me take that back. If you are having a mandatory vaccine plan, if you're implementing mandatory vaccines and you're asking those pre-screening vaccine questions, I caution you, do not ask about family members' medical histories at all, because that may violate GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. As employers, you're not allowed to ask or use genetic information to make any decisions related to terms, conditions of employment, may not acquire genetic information into certain circumstances. And those are mostly health related, so I didn't list all of those. And you certainly cannot disclose genetic information. So, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, a question came in and Janet Phoenix is asking, what about personal preference is the reason for not getting vaccinated?
So a personal preference, that is not, and that's something, yeah, that you don't have to accommodate a personal preference or a political reason or anything like that. So if you have a mandatory vaccine policy and the only reason that someone is electing not to participate, it is a condition of employment and they can be terminated for that. If they say that it's a disability or anything that we've discussed before, then you would have to have that accommodation question. But if it's merely a personal preference and you have that mandatory policy, then it becomes that condition of employment and they can be terminated or disciplined. Now, you have to look at your workforce and decide a couple things. You know, how is that going to affect the morale? How is that going to affect the employees? Is that, and these are all the things you have to consider when you're trying to come up with that mandatory vaccine plan. How many employees will I have to terminate? We know that retaining employees is difficult, especially now. Hiring employees is costly. So you have to look at that. These are all considerations that go into a discussion about whether the company wants to have a mandatory vaccine policy. But yes, if it's a personal preference, then you can terminate that employee because it would be a condition of employment once you made that mandatory vaccine plan. Okay. Next question on the genetic information. And again, this is when the employer asks those pre-screening questions, not if you have a third party asking those pre-screening questions. So if you decide you're going to hire that outside third party and they want to ask questions, as long as you, the employer, do not have that information, have access to the information, you certainly don't want them to tell you, oh, by the way, you know, 5 of your employees didn't get vaccinated because of these reasons. You don't care. You don't want to have that discussion with them. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just as a refresher, because I think GINA is a very unique act in Maryland, I wanted just to define what genetic information really is. And it really kind of goes back to family medical history and individuals' genetic test. I think, over the past several years, Ancestry.com has become super popular. I think, what was it, 22, 22andMe, 21andMe, I don't know, one of those. But a lot of these genetic testing companies are very popular, and a number of people, at least in my office, talk about the results of those genetic tests. And while we're all having those conversations in the office, in the the snack room over lunch, now if you're a supervisor or if you're a manager of these employees and you have information that someone is predisposed to cancer or predisposed to high blood pressure or anything like that, and that information is ever the basis of any type of condition of employment down the road, then that does expose the company to liability, because we're not allowed to discriminate for any reason based off of that information. So especially during COVID vaccine testing, it's not unusual that employees will start talking about their family medical history or how family members have reacted to certain vaccines. I have an uncle who broke out in an allergic reaction. I didn't realize that maybe that's something that my family, I have to get checked out for an alert. So people are just volunteering information, and it's very comfortable, but at the same time as it's comfortable, you have people who are or have that knowledge, and it may not be that we discriminate now, but it may come out later. So I just want to caution everybody as we're having those conversations, and it's important to train supervisors and managers as to what they ask or what they learn from their employees when people are talking about vaccines. So if you are going to have a mandatory vaccine policy or plan, please communicate to your supervisors and managers what it is you can say, what it is that you can't say, and how to have those conversations. Even in the involuntary world, where we're just recommending vaccines, you may still have these conversations. So I would, again, caution your supervisors, employees as to what they can and can't say, or what they learn and don't learn about people. Okay, next slide. So when Hillary asked, that I do this, I've already received so many vaccine questions, and I really wanted to touch on some of the vaccine questions that you all have or that you all face. And they're the same vaccine questions that I get every single day. So it's not unusual for these questions. And I think it raises a lot of issues that, whether to mandate vaccines or not, it's not an easy decision for a company to make. So just as a recap, employers can mandate that employees get vaccinated. It's not a medical examination, and you may condition employment on vaccination status, provided that you grant accommodations to those people who have disabilities or for religious reasons. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop as to that's everything that we've talked about so far. You're probably saying, wow, she could have done that in one slide, but that wouldn't have explained it as well. So anyway, okay, next slide. So one of the questions is, can I require my employees to tell me if they are vaccinated? And if so, to provide proof? And the answer is yes. Employers can require proof of vaccination. Remember, vaccination is not a medical examination. You are not learning any type of private medical information. What you do not want to learn, as we talked about, is you don't need to have a disability related inquiry. You don't need to know why they haven't been vaccinated. So I don't need to hear any medical information as part of that proof of vaccination. So if you're asking your employees, if you're in a voluntary status, hey, you know, how many people or have, you can go around and say, have you been vaccinated? Have you not been vaccinated? Yes or no. That's all you need to know. You can get a head count. You can find out, wow, I have 80% of my workforce is vaccinated. That's great. But I would say if you're asking those questions and you have an employee that hasn't been vaccinated and they want to voluntarily provide you additional information, you don't need to know, especially if it's a voluntary program, right? Voluntary. So questions on that? Okay, awesome. Next slide. Oops. Is that one more? Go back one more, I think. Okay, there. Right one. Okay. So what if an employee has already, is that the, let's see. Okay. What if an employee already has COVID-19? Should they still get vaccinated? Yes. So if an employee says, you know, I've had COVID, I'm not going to get vaccinated, I don't need to get vaccinated. Again, that's not a disability and it's not a sincerely held religious belief. So there's no reason to accommodate if you have a mandatory vaccine policy and they can be required to get vaccinated. If it is voluntary, you can only encourage them to get vaccinated because that's what the CDC has recommended. And we want to make sure that as many people get vaccinated. So we're not sure how long protection lasts for those persons who've had COVID-19. The medical evidence, we don't have enough information. We're not even sure, honestly, I mean, and I'm not a medical doctor, I don't know how long the vaccination protection lasts. And I think that that's something that they're still studying. So vaccination should be offered to workers regardless of whether they already had COVID-19. We certainly don't want to discriminate, excuse me, against those individuals either. So we don't want to say, oh, we're only going to vaccinate employees who haven't had COVID-19. We don't want to do that. And we cannot require employees to have an antibody test before or after they are vaccinated. That's taking it one step too far. Okay, next slide. May employers treat unvaccinated employees differently than vaccinated employees? So this is actually probably the biggest question I'm receiving like currently, because everyone wants to update their policies. They want to return people to work. They're not quite sure, you know, how to treat vaccinated and unvaccinated employees, but you can treat them differently. Absolutely. And the reason we can treat them differently is because the CDC has issued guidance that, and that goes back to that first slide, that fully vaccinated employees do not need to wear a mask. So employees who are fully vaccinated do not need to quarantine if they have an exposure. So there's a number of reasons, and you go back to that first slide or the second slide, as to everything that fully vaccinated persons are allowed to do, so that as an employer, you can certainly treat those those vaccinated employees and unvaccinated employees differently. Now, what you cannot do is you cannot treat an unvaccinated employee less favorably in terms and conditions of employment. And this is extremely important when we are talking about incentives, and we'll have a slide on that, as to whether you are treating them differently in terms and conditions of employment, and we'll talk about that. If the employee rejects the vaccine, of course, we have to accommodate. You guys could probably answer these questions now that we've talked about them, but I'm going to repeat a lot of these things over and over, so we are all aware. It's unlikely that requiring an unvaccinated employee to wear a mask would be considered a less favorable term and condition of employment. So if you have mask policies in place, you can certainly ask your unvaccinated employees to continue wearing a mask and have your vaccinated employees not wear a mask. I mean, but it's also a morale thing. It depends on how many people are vaccinated in your organization. If everybody's vaccinated, it's not a huge deal. If you have, 10, 15, 20, 30 employees that are unvaccinated, maybe it's a bigger deal, and it's just easier to say everybody wear a mask. But you have to look at your own organization to make that determination. But again, it's not required. But you as an employer can make those decisions uniquely to your workplace. Now, OSHA continues to recommend that vaccinated workers continue to follow protective measures. OSHA has not updated their regulations yet. They are reviewing them based upon the CDC guidance that came out last week, but they haven't updated them yet. So as of today, we still have to, for OSHA's purposes, continue to follow protective measures such as wearing face coverings and physically, socially distancing from employees. Because remember, under OSHA, just the general protection standard is that you as an employer have to make sure that you provide a safe environment for all employees in the workplace.
Cheryl, a question just came through from Julia. She says, saying vaccinated staff no longer need to wear a mask, but unvaccinated staff would reveal their vaccination status to their coworkers. Is this then revealing their private health information?
No, because whether someone is vaccinated or unvaccinated, remember that's not a medical examination, so that is fine. But the best practice would be, if you're writing a policy, is obviously if people want to continue wearing masks, it's optional for them. So when you're rolling it out, you're rolling out a policy that says, people who are fully vaccinated don't need to wear a mask. And again, you have to decide who's going to go around and really police this. If you're a small organization, it's easier to police than if you're a large organization. But regardless of that, if you have a policy that says fully vaccinated people don't need to wear a mask, unvaccinated people need to wear a mask, or anyone that has would elect to wear a mask, then they can elect to wear a mask. I mean, we have people who are fully vaccinated, they still are high risk, and they choose to wear a mask. So the option is always there. If people need to wear a mask for OSHA reasons or the health and safety of patients or clients or customers or anything like that, absolutely. We're going to continue wearing masks when we meet with clients. We continue to have those plexiglass things. We still have those. So while at least in our office, fully vaccinated people do not have to wear a mask, I have yet to see anybody not wear a mask. Everybody has continued wearing one. So you can roll out, I don't know if it's going to be so blatant, but yeah, you're going to learn pretty quickly, I guess, who is unvaccinated, but you may not. I mean, people may, still wear masks because of maybe disabilities. So we're not going to ask questions about it, but it is not a medical examination. So it's okay to learn who's vaccinated and who's not. Okay, other questions? Okay, next.
Cheryl, this is Hillary. I just wanted to jump in
Sure.
and mention that for the congregate settings, there is also the additional guidance from DDA, which may be more strict. So what's described on the slide is sort of the high level guidance from the CDC that would be appropriate for like in headquarters or an office setting. But if there's stricter guidance related to a congregate setting, that should be followed in those circumstances.
Absolutely. And I think, even that, if you go back to that first slide, the CDC is very careful to state that, this is our guidance, but you have to comply with, whatever regulation, compliance issues, state, everything. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. And I think that that's important to reiterate. Okay, next slide. Okay, can an employer offer incentives for an employee to be vaccinated? So it really depends. And I say it depends. In most companies, there's a number of companies and even organizations, you know, you get free donuts, you get free pizza, you can to get vaccinated. There's a lot of incentives out there for people to get vaccinated. I think, I don't know what state it was, but they were having $1 million lottery for everyone that's been vaccinated. They can participate in that $1 million lottery. And only those people, if they show their card, can participate in that. So there are a lot of incentives out there. And what the EEOC is suggesting, and that's kind of based off of making sure that we're not discriminating against people who are unvaccinated for qualified disabilities or sincerely held religious beliefs. So if you have an employee who's pregnant and cannot get vaccinated, and you're offering $250 to every employee that gets vaccinated, well, that's a significant amount of money to that one employee who can't get vaccinated. Absolutely not. Their doctor has said no. They may want to, but they can't. And now they're out that $250. So what the EEOC is recommending, and they haven't come out with definitive language, is if you keep these incentives de minimis, it's a very legal term for small, offer those paid days off to allow the employees to get their vaccinations, allow paid days off if they need to recover from the vaccine. Water bottles, lunch, gift cards, cash, just keep it small, maybe not offer $250. Now, like I said, with that said, I know a number of clients, businesses that are offering very significant incentives to their employees to get vaccinated. I also know clients who have offered not one incentive and 90% of their workforce is vaccinated. So it just depends. If you're considering a mandatory vaccine policy and you don't want to do that, but you want to offer incentives, just keep in mind, your workforce as you offer those incentives. And we don't want to really coerce employees in providing their kind of disability information. So if we're offering these incentives and someone says, well, I can't do it, and they have to tell you why, and now all of a sudden, you're almost paying or not paying people or to elicit that information. The legal world is very, I could see a lot of lawsuits coming out of this dependent upon, how much we're offering employees to get vaccinated. Okay, questions on incentives? Okay, I still think Krispy Kreme donut is offering donuts every day for people who are vaccinated. So I know that. I haven't gone there, but my kids definitely go there. Okay, can we require employees who refuse to be vaccinated to sign a waiver or release of claims against the company if they contract COVID-19 at work? We had this question a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, or really not really at the beginning, but as companies were reopening over the summer and into last fall, they wanted everybody to sign waivers. I was against waivers. I do not necessarily think that they are enforceable to waive your future rights. Also, most of your employees are covered under workers' comp, and you can't sign a waiver. You can't waive your right to workers' comp benefits. With that said, they have yet to determine that COVID-19 falls under workers' comp. So most viruses do not fall under workers' comp. I know that there's a number of states that have included COVID-19 under workers' comp. I can't remember if we talked about this last time, but while I say that COVID-19 does not fall under workers' comp, there are situations, especially in the healthcare space, where they have attributed an employee contracting COVID-19 while at the workplace, meaning that they were moving a patient who had tested positive for COVID-19. Everybody was aware. The patient became aggravated, tore off the employee's mask, coughed, was all over, and then that employee contracted COVID within the time period. So there are situations where COVID-19 may fall under workers' comp, which is another reason why you can't have these waivers. Waivers between employers and employees cannot cover OSHA. So that's another reason. And waivers, if it kind of says to your employees, look, we may not be that safe and you can't sue us, but we're going to do the best we can. So the best thing to do is to implement all the safety requirements that you can, communicate to your employees, make sure that they understand what those safety precautions are, make sure they understand you're following the CDC and the state and local guidance. That's your best defense, is having written policies in place, communicating, updating those policies as the regulations change. That's going to be probably the best way to make sure that you're not exposed to liability. So questions on waivers? Okay, next slide. Okay, do I need to request updated information for an employee who has a disability and is returning to the workplace? So this is a situation where maybe you've been closed, and probably, I would say in the congregate setting, you probably have already been, you haven't really been closed, but if for anyone that is returning to the workplace and now they have a disability, or they have a disability, you've provided them accommodation in the past, do you need to update that information? There's no real reason to update it unless you have a mandatory vaccine policy. If you have that mandatory vaccine policy, then you're really going to have to update the information, because it does the employee's physician really not recommend that employee get vaccinated? So that would be another reason the employee, or another reason to update it. But if the employee comes back and says I need a different accommodation, I need to work from home because my disability doesn't allow me to be near people who have COVID, you may need to update that information based off of COVID. It's always best to have documentation from a medical provider, especially as it relates to a qualified disability, because when a doctor says they need an accommodation, in a legal world, that's the best documentation you can have. But when you're getting that accommodation request, make sure you understand the time frame around it, how long they need that accommodation. Is that something that, and then you can reevaluate that in 30, 60, 90 days if you want. So if an employee refuses to return to work based off of a disability, you absolutely can ask for medical provider certification. Okay. Next slide. Okay, should I include contractors, temporary employees in my COVID-19 vaccination plan? So for workers employed by contract firms or temporary help agencies, staffing agencies, then the agency and the host employer are joint employers, and joint employer liability is significant because it treats you as if you are the employer, if you are the staffing agency or the contractor that is providing employees to that organization. So you're both responsible for maintaining that safe working environment. The extent of the responsibilities the staffing agency and the host employer will have depend on the workplace conditions, and you should put those in that, or maybe update those contracts. But again, making sure that you communicate your policy to the staffing agency or to the contractors, and then making sure that they comply with those regulations is important. We have a number of, contractors who basically say, everybody that comes on my site has to be vaccinated. While the organization or the employer may not be mandating vaccines, the client, the customer, the contractor is saying, absolutely, we have a mandated vaccination policy. So you need to only send employees who are vaccinated to that site. And that's absolutely legal. Again, keep in mind that you have certain accommodations that you might have. Now, if you don't have employees that you can send, that's going to be a whole different conversation, because you're going to have to find employees, I guess, if you want to maintain that contract, to send over to that work site. If someone is unvaccinated and can't continue to work on that property or on that site, don't fire them immediately. You may just have to move them to a different site and change people's schedules. But that's when we get back into the accommodation and, undue hardship and all that. That was our previous discussion. So, questions on contractors or temporary employees? Okay, you guys are good. Or it's just the end of the day and you're very quiet. Okay, next slide. Okay, when can employers terminate? Again, it depends. If an employee cannot get vaccinated due to a disability, we're going to make sure that there's no reasonable accommodation that exists before we even terminate. We're going to make sure we document that you cannot accommodate them and you've considered all reasonable options. Document why the company cannot accommodate, why can't the job be done remotely. That's probably not easy, especially in the setting that most of us are involved in. Terminating an employee with a disability, consider whether you want to place them on unpaid leave. Can they be on an unpaid leave status? The problem with unpaid leave, especially in COVID, is we don't know how long the pandemic's going to last. Now, how long their disability lasts is a different question than how long the pandemic's going to last, because the pandemic could be here, for another year for all we know. And having someone on unpaid leave for a year, may not be a reasonable accommodation. And then really look at, does any other type of law apply? Meaning that if there's FMLA, if they have a serious health condition, what does that look like? Should they be placed on FMLA leave? I do want to remind everybody that if your organization is following the FFCRA leave, remember that was the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency paid family and medical leave, that has been extended through September 30th. It has added 3 more options for employees to receive that benefit. In testing, vaccine or getting their vaccine is one of them. If they have any type of illness related to the vaccine, they can use that leave, that FFCRA leave. And if you are electing to follow that, you continue to get that tax benefit for offering that paid sick leave or that paid family medical leave to those employees through September 30th. So that's an option if you want to continue to do that. It is voluntary, it is not mandatory, but it is an option if you are encouraging employees to get vaccinated or they need time off to recover from a vaccine. You have that tax credit that you can take. Okay, next slide. This may be my last one. Okay, perfect. So I kind of covered the high level questions that I see a lot. If there's specific questions, like I said, I'm happy to answer those, but I would also love if people could share what they're doing in their workplaces and what practices have worked for them. Anyone want to go first? You guys are shy. I'm going to call on somebody.
Cheryl, I'll jump in with a
Okay.
question that had actually come up in one of our prior learning collaboratives.
Okay.
And it may be a little specific, but I think it could potentially apply to a number of organizations. And that was, if a client who is fully vaccinated indicates that they don't want to work with a staff person who is unvaccinated, what should the employer consider in that circumstance?
So kind of like based off of the contractors and all of that, they certainly can request that. However, you as an organization, if you're not making vaccines mandatory, then what you can communicate is that we will do our best to accommodate, and these are the people that are available to work with that person. We can't always guarantee it because we don't have a mandatory vaccine policy. Our employees are encouraged to be vaccinated, but I think you have to evaluate, how many vaccinated staff do you have that can work with that client? You certainly can address that, and people have that question all the time. They want to ensure that they're vaccinated. With that said, though, if they were continuing to work with staff members last year, and I certainly don't want to make them uncomfortable, but a lot of people had to work with unvaccinated people last year, and you can always say that you provide the proper safety equipment. We have PPEs. If you're vaccinated, if you're fully vaccinated, the exposure to you is minimal. I'm not going to say that it's not impossible, but the whole reason we're vaccinated is to make sure it's minimal. But you want to ensure that you have those safety measures in place and that you follow all the CDC guidelines, OSHA guidelines, state recommendations to ensure that you have a safe working environment. While you do your best and you can accommodate that request, I wouldn't guarantee it if you don't have a mandated policy, because there may be a time where an unvaccinated staff member has to work with that client. And I certainly wouldn't want that client to rely upon any statement that says, you will always be working with a fully vaccinated staff member. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Thank you.
Okay. Have other organizations mandated vaccines, or is most everybody recommending vaccines? Anybody want to share?
We are just highly recommending at TLC. We are just recommending. We're also not disclosing with the participants or the families. Obviously, like the last question, with someone who wants to work with someone vaccinated, we're just saying that we're highly recommending vaccinations, but we're not sharing information.
Okay.
As far as who's vaccinated and who's not.
Right. You can't.
Yeah, I was just wondering the same thing. If there's anybody here who is making it mandatory.
I would say most of my clients that I deal with, I would say there's a high majority of them who are not making it mandatory. The ones that are making it mandatory usually deal directly with patients, clients. They want to be able to say that their office or their workplace is fully vaccinated to kind of set themselves apart. And for the limited clients that do mandate vaccinations, the very few issues have arisen, which may be because they're smaller organizations and they don't have a lot of the exemptions that we talked about. And I think if you're a larger organization, you're going to have a lot of those issues. And I think the reason people don't make it mandatory is because the exemptions open up another whole set of questions that people don't really want to ask or get into. And then once you go down the path of exemptions, then you're not having a full vaccinated staff. You're still at a certain percentage anyway. So I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Is anyone offering incentives to encourage staff members to get vaccinated?
I don't think she's on here, but I know Daria over at ARC, they were doing monetary incentives about a month or so ago. I don't know if they're still doing it, but I just remember at our first vaccine clinic, she was telling me a little bit about it. She said it was definitely working.
Oh yeah, I think the issue is I say you have to offer de minimis incentives, and that's challenging because that's not going to get people vaccinated. The companies that are offering $250 or more, or extra days off, all sorts of incentives, they're getting their staff vaccinated.
Right.
Offering someone a water bottle, which is what is recommended by the EEOC, is not worth, someone getting vaccinated if they elect, not to. That's probably just my opinion, though. Maybe a water bottle is an incentive. I shouldn't say that. So I think the other question that we have a lot, and it is really the mask wearing based off of vaccinated staff members and employees, and they're kind of related to each other, because now that we can relax the mask wearing, I think someone had asked, that does kind of label those employees who are unvaccinated. And I don't know if that encourages people to get vaccinated. I don't know what effect that will have, but I also don't know how realistic it is that people are going to police the mask wearing of employees. So sometimes people choose to continue the mask policy because of the type of work they're doing. And if you're in that congregate setting, making sure you continue to wear mask and having that appearance that you're going to continue to be extra safe in the workplace is far more important than, having people not wear a mask. So you just have to examine every different workplace. So any other questions, comments, concerns, frustrations? Or we could just give you the extra 10 minutes back, which is probably way more important.
I'm going to also go ahead and have this posted on the PCC website. And then Cheryl, if you're okay with it, I'll go ahead and post the slides as well.
Sure, yeah, you can absolutely post them. And
go ahead.
If anyone has questions, I think I included my email at the end. You can certainly email me. I would encourage everyone to look back at your COVID policies, because the COVID policies we had last year have definitely evolved and changed. So look at your COVID policies, update those policies, and then communicate that out to all of your employees.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I appreciate it. I know everybody definitely appreciates it. Whoever wasn't able to jump on this call, I know that they'll definitely utilize those slides and all the information included. So thank you so much. And Cheryl, I'm sure we're going to need you soon again, but thank you for today. And everybody, thank you for jumping on, joining. Go ahead and email me if you would like the slides earlier. But like I said, give me until close of business tomorrow, and everything should be posted on the PCC website. So everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Cheryl.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Faith. Thanks, Hillary. Have a great day.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.